Welcome back, AP. This is the War of 1812, or the Second War for Independence. This is Chapter 12 of the American Pageant. Make sure you're reading the chapter and you're watching the key concept review videos on the website. Lots of key terms for Chapter 12 and few people to know. So starting with the War of 1812, it began as a result of British impressment, which was where Britain would take Americans and force them into the British Navy. Giving in to the pressures of war, President Madison declared war on Britain on June 18, 1812. Americans invaded Canada through Detroit, but they were soon to lose Detroit and have to retreat. Later, Fort Dearborn, which was in Chicago, fell. U.S. privateers had some better luck until 1813, when the British Navy turned their attention to the United States. Some of the American successes during the War of 1812, the U.S. took Lake Ontario, which allowed the United States to attack and burn York and Toronto. They dispersed the British fleet at Put-in Bay, and William Henry Harrison pushed up the River Thames, and October 5th, 1813, he killed Tecumseh. Andrew Jackson won against the Creek at Horseshoe Bend, and then later he led his men into Florida, and they seized the Spanish Pensacola. After Napoleon's surrender in Europe, the British invade the United States up the Chesapeake Bay. On August 24, 1814, the British entered Washington and burned the White House and several other government buildings. The British moved to Baltimore, where they tried to bombard Fort McHenry, and this is when Francis Scott Key wrote the Star-Spangled Banner. In 1931, it became the national song. Other victories: the United States repelled the British in northern New York. On January 8, 1815, Andrew Jackson defended his position around New Orleans. The British retreated after the Battle of New Orleans, and then the battle itself actually took place a couple of weeks after the war was officially over. Secession, again, New England Federalists were anti-war and anti-republicans. They were led by Daniel Webster. On December 15th of 1814, New England delegates met to discuss new amendments to the Constitution. This was probably to protect New England from growing influence. Once word of peace spread, the Federalists lost all power and were even accused of treason because they were meeting behind the back of the federal government and with talks of secession. They don't know if that was exactly true. The Treaty of Ghent is what ends the War of 1812. A representative group was sent to Belgium, and they were led by John Quincy Adams. It was essentially an armistice that restored all conquered territory. So whatever was gained or lost during the War of 1812, everything returned back to the way it was prior to the war. Neither side was able to impose its will. The effects of the War of 1812: there's a new sense of nationalism which swept through the country, and nationalism is the pride in your country. America was war-tested, and they were able to stand up to Great Britain, and it also solidified them as an independent nation. Native Americans were forced to consent to treaties. Manufacturing and industry began to prosper throughout the United States. And as the Old World European monarchies reestablished their control, the United States looked west to expand their territories. The American system: Congress revived the Bank of the United States in 1816. British imports swamped American markets at below-cost prices, so Congress passed the Tariff of 1816 to protect those infant industries. Infant industries are the new businesses that started during the war. The American system was proposed by Henry Clay, and he established it as a three-part system: one with a strong bank, two with a protective tariff, and 3, by improving the infrastructure of the U.S., so a network of roads and canals. James Monroe's opposition to federally built roads west actually stimulated commercial links west. In 1817, the New York legislature approved the building of a canal linking New York City to Buffalo, the Erie Canal, which was completed by 1825. It quickly paid off or repaid the money it cost to make, and it had an annual income that created this canal building boom. This connected the Northeast to the West, creating a greater North-South division. James Monroe's presidency was known as the Era of Good Feelings. Federalists were all but destroyed. Monroe would start his presidency with tranquility and prosperity as the War of 1812 was over, and America is working on building its infrastructure and bringing about more nationalism. John Quincy Adams in Florida. John Quincy Adams became the Secretary of State under President Monroe. The United States annexed western Florida, but that was under dispute. The Secretary of War, John Calhoun, told Jackson to take any measures to stop Seminole raids on American territory. And Seminole raids were a Native American tribe in Florida that was coming into Georgia. Jackson invaded Florida, and this is known as the Seminole War. John Quincy Adams convinced President Monroe to take responsibility for the Seminole War. President Monroe told the Spanish that America had the right under international law to defend itself against border threats and implied America might take Florida by force. The Spanish minister, Luis de Onís, came to terms, and Spain ceded Florida in return for American claims in Texas. The Panic of 1819, and remember that a panic is a depression, an economic depression, was caused by overspeculation on frontier lands, which caused Western banks to foreclose on a lot of their mortgages. Many Western debtors looked at the National Bank as something that was evil. Western expansion led to 9 new states from the years 1791 to 1819, and the new states allied themselves to the older sections of the United States. The issue of Missouri adds to more division between the North and the South. When Missouri applied for statehood, slavery was established within the state. Representative James Talmadge Jr. proposed to prohibit slavery and emancipation for those already enslaved. Usually states came into the Union as pairs, so that maintained the balance between free and slave states. But if Missouri entered the Union as a slave state, it would upset the balance. There would be more slave state representatives in government than free state representatives. So Henry Clay comes up with a compromise. It's known as the Missouri Compromise. Maine applied for admission at the same time. So a compromise was worked out that Missouri would enter in as a slave state, Maine would enter in as a free state, therefore maintaining the balance in government, 12 to 12 free states to slave states. Then there was a line drawn basically through the Louisiana Territory or the Louisiana Purchase that said any territories north of that line that applied for statehood would be considered free states, and any territories south of that line that applied for statehood would be considered slave states. And this is all the territory from the Louisiana Purchase, and you can see the line here. Missouri was the only exception since it was already establishing itself as a slave state, and since Maine was coming in as a free state, it maintained the balance. Lots of Supreme Court cases under the Marshall Court, which we talked about already in class. So I'm going to click through these slides. You can review them for your notes and then also review your comic strips. All right, Latin America, Spanish colonies were in rebellion in the West Indies. America claimed neutrality, yet they sold ships and supplies which indicated partial recognition. In 1822, President Monroe established diplomatic relations with La Plata, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Mexico. President Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, which basically stated that the U.S. would consider any foreign challenge to sovereignty of existing American nations an unfriendly act. Basically, what the Monroe Doctrine was trying to do was to keep the European monarchies from recreating colonies in the Western Hemisphere. Monroe proclaimed to Europe the idea that the U.S. was a dominant power in the Western Hemisphere.